long last, with Variations 26, 27, 28, and 29, we get the release we've been waiting for. My discussion today is with an amazing pianist named Hie-Yon Choi. Choi shot to fame in Korea after winning 4 of its most prestigious competitions. She has since played with orchestras across the world and is a professor of piano at Seoul National University. Choi and I first met over Skype. She was in Korea and I was in New York. I asked her how she first came to perform the Goldbergs.
Okay, the Goldberg Variations. It was a summer, and I got a letter from Schleswig-Holstein Festival in Germany that they were looking for a pianist who could play half portion of the Goldberg. I knew Goldberg already. I haven't played it, but I haven't listened like so many times. I just woke up with Goldberg and I went to bed with Goldberg.
How long was that time period?
It was more than a year. It was a few years. Not every day, but that was kind of ritual. That became kind of ritual to me. But I didn't dare to play the piece. I think I was 23 or 4. And I was just imagining maybe someday. Finally, when I got this letter, I thought I should do it. I had no doubt. But then I brought it to my teacher, and he was like, no. He said it was, no, you? and I said, I want to do it.
Choi learned the Variations and went on to perform them on television and many times after that. She also performed the Variations in Korea after returning home from studying in Europe.
I started the new millennium with Goldberg Variations, and it was very rare performance in Korea to play Goldberg on piano. So that was kind of an event. At that time, it wasn't popular. So playing only Bach, I played Bach's French Suite, and this Goldberg Variation was like weirdo program. No one had done it. Many people came with curiosity, who does that, and how boring it should be.
Choi plays Bach as though electrically charged. Her Bach is taut and thrilling.
My performance that Goldberg was not boring. So the review was Bach could be so much fun, and it was like new interpretation of Bach and so on and so on.
The second time I met Hie-Yon Choi was in person in Orléans, France, where she was judging a piano competition. And this is where I truly saw her power as a musician. Indulge me for a second as I set the scene. We met in between Choi's judging sessions at a time when the large hall where the competition had been taking place was temporarily unoccupied. We had just over an hour to record her playing. It was the middle of summer, one of those absolutely still, sticky, humid days. The corridors all around the hall were abuzz with activity. Students going to and from practice rooms, opening and closing doors. But inside, it was just the two of us and a whole lot of empty seats. You've been hearing excerpts from this recording session already, and you're about to hear a lot more. They may sound muddier than other recordings, and that's on me. But I think you'll also see how full of life and emotion Choi's playing was. I almost think the heat helped push her into overdrive. I want to share with you that feeling I had, sitting in the hall and totally stunned at the vitality of what I was hearing. Okay, so let's get into it. Variation 26 launches us into the final stretch of the piece, an exuberant, joyful, virtuosic run of variations that comes as an explosion of light after the darkness of Variation 25. It begins with rapid fingerwork in the left hand and simple two-note chords in the right hand. My dad and I used to listen to Variation 26 together when I was a kid, and he'd tell me that if I was ever able to play it, he would buy me a car. He probably felt safe saying that because it's just so technically demanding. Well, I never learned the variation, but I still think about surprising him by learning it and telling him, "Okay, Dad, time to pony up." If Kevin's son's Goldbergs suggested that Bach had a warm, laughing, happy side, Choi's Goldbergs show the unreserved version of it. Not warmth, but fire. Not laughter, but hilarity. Not happiness, but joy. There are many ways to interpret the variations that follow Variation 25. One concept is to fit the variations into a sort of biblical, religious narrative. Their energy and power comes from Bach's deep religious belief. In that interpretation, Variation 25 is a sort of crucifixion, and Variation 26 is the resurrection. Recall how the critic Philip Kennicott described the end of Variation 25.
With that descending line at the very end of the variation, you really feel like the body's been placed in the tomb. The stone has been sealed to the door. There's no light left. The world is as dark as it can be. And then, boom, 26 happens. The 25th marks a kind of death, and the 26th marks a return to life and a rush to the end, a kind of sprint to the end.
Choi also thinks of the variations that follow 25 in religious terms. This is how she describes 26.
I feel like the revelation in the Bible. There is a verse that God's military, the soldiers is coming, the chariots and everything is coming. From the very far, it comes. And
she imagines this heavenly army appearing on the horizon and slowly advancing. She starts very quietly and builds.
And closer.
The angels approach, closer. And in the second half of the variation, they arrive.
I greet this crowd of angels. I greet them with great joy. And this is about the end of my life, I think.
The celebration continues in Variation 27. Choi likens it to a scene from the Bible in which King David and the Israelites celebrate the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. It's a scene of effusive joy. The Bible says, David danced with all his might before the Lord, while all around him men shouted and played instruments. 27 is the final canon of the variations, the canon at an interval of a ninth. This is a weird, discordant interval, and yet Bach makes it feel totally normal. There are only two voices in this canon. Listen to the beginning. The first voice comes in, and then the second comes immediately after. First voice, second voice. They play back and forth like dancers trading moves, seeing who can do each better, but always complimenting each other. First voice, second voice. Then we get to Variation 28, where the biblical imagery continues, at least as Choi tells it. This time, it's a sense of a clock ticking as the end of time draws near.
By the Variation 28, I can remind of a cantata. The Stunde is coming, and the clock is clocking.
So it's this ticking clock.
This is ticking clock.
Variation 28 has always amazed me. It creates this kind of shimmering texture with rapidly alternating notes in the middle voice. Meanwhile, as the right hand is playing those alternating notes, it has to leap up at the beginning of every beat as if sounding a little bell, or the chime of a clock, counting down the end of time.
And then what happens next? Bam, dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da bam, dee 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 dee. It's an organ. No doubt. I think 99% of all people would think this is organ. And the organ is for me with this imagination that the orchestra in the heaven. And this is like kingdom. It's the palace.
29 is the arrival of all arrivals. In Choi's imagination, it's the arrival into the kingdom of heaven. The variation has two main textures. The first is this triumphant, percussive, rapid succession of chords, like the great walls of the palace rising before you. The second is a kind of waterfall of notes.
It's kind of really tumbling and rolling.
As the variation continues, the two textures trade off. In Choi's telling, this whole progression from variation 25 to 29 is the arrival of God, who has come for us after death in variation 25. No doubt Bach never thought of these variations with the same precise associations that Choi described, but it's easy to see how his faith could inform the sort of story that underlies the progression of the Goldberg Variations. After all, Bach said that music was written in the service of God. But maybe these variations are also about Bach just letting loose. They're the opposite of heavenly. They're indulging in worldly pleasure, delighting in the virtuosity which is finally on full display here. I'm now going to tell you about the more freewheeling side of Bach, the thought being that maybe it's really this side of him coming through in these last variations. Even though we think of Bach as primarily a church musician, he had other outlets for making music. One was the Collegium Musicum, a semi-professional group in Leipzig that Bach directed throughout the 1730s. Telemann led the group before Bach, and the group became one of Leipzig's elite music ensembles, attracting the best professional musicians and students in the city. Under Bach, the group became famous. The Collegium played year-round throughout Leipzig, not just in churches, but also in coffee houses and coffee gardens. These were places where the intelligentsia and the young, hip crowd came to have fun. This is from Bach's Coffee Cantata, which we'll talk about very soon. At the time, coffee was viewed with a tinge of moral approbation that made drinking coffee kind of cool or rebellious. Sir John Eliot Gardiner gives a wonderful account of the Collegium Musicum under Bach. Bach thrived in the coffee house. He and the Collegium Musicum played for 2 hours every week throughout the year. In the summer, they played in the coffee gardens. In the winter, they played in Zimmermann's coffee house in the center of town. The audience in the coffee house was different from the audience in church. As Gardiner describes, church audiences were often distracted, chatty, and bored. Soldiers would stand in the back of the church talking. In church, Bach may have presented the most glorious music ever written, but many of the congregants probably weren't even listening. The coffee house, by contrast, attracted a more refined, music-loving audience. Even card playing was discouraged so as not to detract. When the performance ended, people sometimes stood up to dance. It would have been just pure fun. I think of the coffee house as the venue in which Bach may have felt the freest and most appreciated. As a cantor in the Thomas Church, he had teaching responsibilities and administrative obligations in addition to conducting and composing. He had to deal with the town council and he had the perennial problem of bad and worsening singers in his church choirs, which infuriated him. But with the Collegium, he was answerable to the public, not to the church or the town council. And his musicians were committed, virtuosic performers, not the pubescent boys who filled his church choirs. Bach's Coffee Cantata, a satirical piece that he wrote for and performed in the coffee house, offers an example of Bach just having fun. It begins with a solo singer exhorting the crowd to stop chattering and listen up. There's gossip to hear.
Schweigt stille, plaudert nicht und höret, was jetzt und geschieht.
Liesgen is a young woman intent on drinking coffee. Her grumpy father wishes more than anything that she would give up coffee and find a suitable husband to marry. In one scene, he sings, "You bad child, you wild girl, oh, if I could only have my way, get rid of coffee."
Loses Mädchen, ach, wenn erlang ich meinen Zweck.
Liesgen could care less. To her, coffee is sweeter than 1,000 kisses, she sings. While the grumpy dad goes around town looking for an eligible bachelor, his daughter is telling everyone that she'll only marry someone if he adds a provision to the marriage contract saying she can drink as much coffee as she wants. In the end, there's comic reconciliation. The chorus sings the great realization of the story. Quote, "The cat doesn't leave the mouse. Young ladies stay coffee addicts. The mother loves coffee, and so does the grandmother. Who can blame the daughters?" This story doesn't seem like Bach, does it? It's certainly not Bach the Grump or Bach the serious and devout Christian. It's a different, lighter side of Bach. We've strayed a bit from the Goldberg Variations, but I think there's a connection. On the one hand, there's a powerful religious story that you can recount with the variations that follow Variation 25. It's the resurrection of Christ and the entry into heaven, resplendent with joyful celebration. On the other hand, these variations are simply fun. They're boisterous, exuberant, filled with life, the kind of energy that Bach might have felt at the coffee house. As Bach aged, his views on the purpose of music changed. From insisting early on that music was for God alone, Bach wrote in 1738, just 3 years before he published the Goldberg Variations, that music's purpose was, quote, "the praise of God and the recreation of the soul." He changed. He became more worldly. The title page of the Goldberg Variations announces that the piece is, quote, "composed for music lovers to refresh their spirits," which seems to adopt that second, recreational purpose of music. It's a piece meant to divert and entertain. With Variations 26 through 29, we get this amazing confluence of Bach's two-part concept for the purpose of music. On the one hand, there's this convincing religious narrative of death and resurrection. On the other, maybe we don't need a narrative. We can just experience the raw excitement that comes from listening to someone execute this wildly complicated music. Here is Hie-Yon Choi playing Variations 26 through 29, live from midsummer in an empty concert hall in the Loire Valley. Hope you enjoy. That's what you call playing with guts. In this episode, besides Hie-Yon Choi, you also heard excerpts from Bach's Coffee Cantata, performed by the Netherlands Bach Society. Thanks to my editor, David Schreiberg, as well as to my parents, who offered valuable comments on this episode in particular. 30 Bach is taking a break. Don't worry, it's just a week. We'll be back for the final episodes in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening, and see you then.